I'm Lina Rivera, 21 years old. Until 3 months ago, I believed that if you worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, you could build the life you wanted on your own terms. Then my father showed up at my apartment door with my 3-year-old nephew and shattered everything I thought I knew about family, dreams, and what it means to choose yourself. I had just finished my second week at Mode magazine, the internship I'd clawed my way toward since freshman year. Editorial assistant seemed like such a small title, but to me it felt like stepping through a doorway into the person I was meant to become. I could see my future stretching ahead. Bylines, fashion weeks, a life where creativity and ambition mattered more than obligation. But when I opened that door and saw Dad holding Mason's tiny hand, his face etched with exhaustion and something that looked like defeat, I knew my carefully constructed plans were about to crumble. He didn't even ask. Just told me Mari had relapsed again and he needed to fly to Phoenix immediately. How do you choose between the future you've built and the family that's already broken you once? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in my small San Diego apartment. I remember because I was wearing my favorite vintage blazer, the one I'd found at a thrift store in Hillcrest and altered myself. Navy blue with gold buttons that caught the light just right when I moved. I'd learned early that in the fashion world, looking the part was half the battle, and I couldn't afford not to win every small victory I could claim. Callie was already gone when I woke up, probably at her 6 a.m. spin class before her marketing internship downtown. We'd been roommates since sophomore year at UCSD, and she was the kind of friend who believed in my dreams even when they seemed impossible. Our apartment was a testament to our respective obsessions. Her side of the living room filled with business books and vision boards, mine scattered with fashion magazines, fabric samples, and the vintage sewing machine I'd bought with my first paycheck from the campus bookstore. I made coffee in our tiny kitchen, the same routine I'd perfected over the past 2 years. French press, oat milk, exactly 2 spoonfuls of brown sugar. Small rituals that made me feel like I had control over something, even when everything else felt precarious. The morning light streamed through our east-facing window, illuminating the stack of Mode magazines I kept on our coffee table like sacred texts. Working at Mode wasn't just a job. It was validation that all those nights spent writing fashion analysis pieces for the campus paper, all those unpaid hours styling photo shoots for student organizations, all those carefully crafted emails to editors who never wrote back, had finally led somewhere. Isabel Carrington, the fashion director, had actually said my portfolio showed promise during my interview. Promise. I'd held on to that word like a lifeline. The commute to the Mode offices in downtown San Diego took 45 minutes on public transit, but I didn't mind. I spent the time reading Vogue, WWD, and any fashion publication I could get my hands on, absorbing trends and industry gossip like studying for an exam I couldn't afford to fail. Other passengers probably thought I was just another fashion-obsessed college girl, but this felt like research, like preparation for the life I was building one careful step at a time. Mode's offices occupied the 12th floor of a glass building overlooking the harbor. Walking into that lobby every morning felt like entering a different world, one where creativity and ambition lived in the same space, where people talked about color palettes and brand narratives with the same intensity others reserved for family or religion. The receptionist, a woman named Claire with perfectly winged eyeliner and an enviable collection of statement earrings, always greeted me with genuine warmth. She remembered that I took my coffee black and that I was studying journalism with a focus on fashion media. Isabel's office was a shrine to impeccable taste. White walls covered with framed magazine covers, a glass desk that seemed to float in, the afternoon light, and racks of sample pieces from emerging designers. She moved through the space with the kind of confidence I was still learning to fake. Her perfectly curated outfits making statements I was still learning to read. When she spoke about fashion, it wasn't just about clothes. It was about storytelling, about cultural moments, about the way style could communicate things that words couldn't capture. Fashion isn't frivolous, she'd told me during my first week, her dark eyes serious behind designer frames. It's anthropology. It's history. It's the way people choose to present themselves to the world, and that choice matters. I'd written those words in my notebook and read them back to myself whenever imposter syndrome crept in. Whenever I wondered if I belonged in rooms filled with people who'd been born into the kind of life I was fighting to create. My internship. Duties were mostly administrative, organizing sample closets, updating databases, coordinating appointments. But Isabel occasionally asked for my opinion on emerging trends or upcoming features. Those moments felt like gold. Proof that my perspective had value in this world I'd been trying to enter for so long. I'd grown up in a small apartment in Barrio Logan, with my father and older sister Mari, in a neighborhood where dreams like mine felt both necessary and impossible. Dad worked construction, leaving the house before dawn and coming home with hands stained by honest work that paid just enough to keep us fed and housed. After Mom died when I was 9, our house became a place where survival took precedence over ambition, where college was a luxury we couldn't quite afford but couldn't afford not to pursue. Mari had been the artistic one, the daughter who painted murals on bedroom walls and saw beauty in things the rest of us overlooked. But somewhere in her early 20s, art became escape, and escape became addiction. And the sister who'd once helped me see the world in color disappeared into a haze of substances and broken promises. Dad never talked about it directly, just tightened his jaw when Mari's name came up and worked longer hours to fill the silence her absence left behind. I'd learned to navigate around the holes in our family, to build dreams big enough to carry me away from the weight of other people's broken pieces. Fashion became my language for something beyond survival, my way of imagining a life where beauty and creativity weren't luxuries, but daily bread. Every magazine I studied, every trend I analyzed, every perfectly curated outfit I put together was a step away from the girl who'd grown up believing that wanting more was selfish. The morning Dad showed up at my door, I'd been at Mode for exactly 2 weeks and 3 days. I was finally starting to feel like I belonged there, like the girl from Barrio Logan could exist in the same space as the future fashion editor I was becoming. Isabel had just assigned me to help coordinate a photo shoot featuring local designers, and I'd spent the previous evening researching each brand's aesthetic and signature pieces. I was reviewing my notes over breakfast when my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Coming over. Need to talk." No explanation, no warning, just the kind of message that made my stomach drop because it meant family crisis was headed my way again. Dad didn't make social visits to my apartment. When he showed up unannounced, it was always because something had gone wrong that required my immediate attention and sacrifice. I tried to push down the anxiety rising in my chest as I got ready for work. Maybe it was something small, a problem with the lease on his apartment, or questions about health insurance, or one of the dozens of bureaucratic puzzles that seem to multiply when you lived paycheck to paycheck. Maybe it had nothing to do with Mari, nothing to do with the sister whose addiction had already derailed our family's fragile stability more times than I could count. But when I heard the knock at my door 3 hours later, when I was supposed To be at Mode helping Isabel prep for the afternoon editorial meeting, I knew immediately that my carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the old one I'd been trying to escape. I could hear it in the weight of his footsteps, in the way he knocked. Not urgent, but heavy with the kind of resignation that meant someone else's crisis had become my responsibility. Through the peephole, I could see Dad standing in the hallway, holding a small suitcase in one hand. Next to him, barely visible at his height, was a child with dark hair and familiar eyes. My nephew Mason, who I'd seen maybe a dozen times in his 3 years of life, mostly during brief visits when Mari was between relapses, and attempting to play mother to the little boy who deserved so much more stability than our family had ever been able to provide. The moment I opened the door, Mason launched himself at my legs with the unself-conscious affection that only small children possess. "Tia Lina," he said, his voice bright with excitement, as if showing up at my apartment with a suitcase was the most natural thing in the world. He was wearing a wrinkled Spider-Man t-shirt and jeans that were slightly too big, his dark hair sticking up. In the back, where he'd probably slept against a car window, Dad's face told a different story. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they had just a month ago, and his usually pristine work clothes looked rumpled, like he'd been wearing them for longer than intended. He stepped into my apartment, without being invited, his movements carrying the weight of decisions already made without my input. "Mari's in the hospital," he said, setting the suitcase down with finality. "Phoenix General. Overdose, but she's stable." The words came out matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather, but I could see the way his hands shook slightly as he reached into his pocket for his phone. "I'm flying out tonight. Need you to watch Mason." It wasn't a request. In our family, when crisis hit, responsibility rolled downhill to whoever was most stable, most available, most likely to say yes, without asking inconvenient questions about timing or personal plans. That had always been me. The daughter who got good grades, who stayed out of trouble, who built a life careful enough to serve as backup for everyone else's disasters. "Dad, I can't," I said automatically, the words coming out before I'd fully processed what he was asking. "I have work. I just started at Mode, and they're counting on me for a photo shoot this week. I can't just disappear." Mason had found my collection of vintage jewelry on the coffee table, and was examining a pair of earrings with the focused attention of a tiny archaeologist. He seemed completely oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults, lost in his own world of discovery and play. "Work will understand," Dad said, in the tone that meant the conversation was over. "This is family, Lina. Family comes first." He pulled out his phone and showed me his boarding pass, a red-eye flight leaving San Diego at 11:47 p.m. "Mari's been clean for 2 months this time. Something went wrong. But the doctors think if I get there, if she has support, she might actually stick with treatment this time." I wanted to ask how many times we'd heard that before. How many times Mari had promised to get clean and stay clean and be the mother Mason deserved. I wanted to point out that I had my own life now, my own dreams that mattered, my own carefully constructed future that couldn't just be put on hold every time our family's dysfunction demanded a sacrifice. Instead, I watched Mason discover my vintage button collection, his small fingers sorting through decades of collected treasures with the kind of wonder I'd forgotten was possible. He held up a mother-of-pearl button from a 1950s cocktail dress and asked, "What's this one for, Tia?" "It's from a dress that someone wore to fancy parties a long time ago," I told him, sitting down on the floor next to him. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in his small face, the way his eyes held shadows that no 3-year-old should carry. Someone probably danced in that dress, maybe even fell in love. Mason nodded solemnly, like this made perfect sense, and carefully placed the button back in its small wooden box. "Mama likes pretty things too," he said quietly. "But she gets sick sometimes." The simple honesty of it broke something open in my chest. This little boy had already learned to navigate around the holes in his world, to find beauty and stability wherever he could grab it. He was 3 years old, and already knew more about disappointment and adaptation than most adults ever learn. Dad was watching us with something that might have been relief or guilt. I couldn't tell which. "He's been asking for you," he said. Last time Mari brought him around, he kept talking about his tia Lina, who has all the pretty clothes and knows about fashion. "I think he feels safe with you." Safe. The word hit me like a physical blow, because I knew what it meant in our family. Not just protected from harm, but protected from the chaos of loving someone whose addiction made them unreliable at best and dangerous at worst. Mason needed safe, and somehow, in his 3-year-old wisdom, he'd decided I was the person who could provide it. "How long?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be longer than I could afford. "However long it takes," Dad said. "Could be a week, could be a month. Depends on whether Mari actually commits to treatment this time." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "There's $500 for expenses. Food, diapers if he needs them, whatever. Mari's caseworker has my number if there's an emergency." $500. As if the cost of derailing my internship, my carefully planned future, my first real chance at the life I'd been building, could be measured in grocery money and emergency contacts. I thought about Isabel expecting me at the editorial meeting, about the photo shoot I was supposed to help coordinate, about the promises I'd made to myself about not letting family dysfunction define my choices anymore. But then Mason looked up, at me with eyes that were so much like Mari's before addiction stole the light from them. And I realized that some choices aren't really choices at all. They're just the next right thing in a series of impossible situations. "Okay," I said, the word tasting like surrender. "Okay, I'll do it." Dad's relief was visible, the tension leaving his shoulders like air escaping a balloon. He knelt down next to Mason and ruffled his hair with unusual gentleness. "You're going to stay with Tia Lina for a while, okay, mijo? I'm going to help Mama get better, and Tia Lina is going to take really good care of you." Mason nodded with the resigned acceptance of a child who'd learned early that adults made plans and children adapted to them. "Can I play with the buttons again?" he asked me, and I nodded, watching him return to his careful sorting with renewed focus. After Dad left for the airport, after I'd called Isabel and explained that a family emergency would keep me away from work for an indefinite period, after I'd rearranged my entire life around the needs of a 3-year-old I barely knew, I sat on my living room floor watching Mason build elaborate structures out of my vintage button collection and tried to figure out how everything had changed so quickly. This morning I'd been Lina Rivera, promising young fashion professional, building a life that belonged entirely to me. Tonight I was Tia Lina, temporary guardian, watching Peppa Pig episodes, while a small boy who shared my sister's eyes fell asleep against my shoulder, clutching a stuffed elephant that smelled like unfamiliar laundry detergent and broken promises. Callie found us like that when she came home from her evening yoga class. Mason curled up in my lap, both of us surrounded by the debris of a life that had been reorganized in a single afternoon. She took one look at the scene and immediately understood that something fundamental had shifted. "How long?" she asked, settling down on the floor next to us. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe a week, maybe longer." I traced patterns on Mason's, back while he slept, marveling at how quickly he'd claimed space in our carefully organized apartment. His suitcase sat open in the corner, revealing the haphazard packing of someone who'd been in crisis. Mismatched clothes, a few toys, a photo of him and Mari at some happier moment I didn't remember being part of. "What about Maude?" Callie asked gently. Isabel said she understood. That family comes first. But understanding and being able to hold my position are different things. I felt tears threatening and forced them back. Crying wouldn't change anything, and Mason needed me to be steady, reliable, safe. "I'll figure it out. I always do." But lying there in the dark later that night, listening to Mason's steady breathing from the air mattress we'd set up in my room, I wondered if figuring it out would be enough this time. I wondered if there was a limit to how many times you could rebuild your life around other people's crises before you forgot who you were trying to become in the first place. Outside my window, San Diego's lights twinkled like promises I might never get to keep. And I held on to the hope that somehow, some way, I could find a path that led both of us towards something better than the broken patterns we'd inherited. The first few days with Mason felt like learning a language I'd never studied. He woke up every morning at exactly 6:30, climbed onto my bed, and announced his needs with the straightforward honesty of someone who hadn't yet learned to apologize for taking up space. "I'm hungry, Tia. My tummy is making the growling sound." I quickly discovered that caring for a 3-year-old was nothing like babysitting for neighbors in high school. This wasn't a few hours of games and snacks. This was meals and naps and baths, and the endless vigilance required to keep a small human safe and entertained. Mason had opinions about everything. He would only eat peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles. He required exactly 3 bedtime stories, and he had developed an intense attachment to a stuffed elephant named Peanut that went everywhere with him. Peanut had clearly seen better days. The gray fabric was worn thin in places, one ear was slightly chewed, and the trunk had been repaired with bright blue thread that didn't match. But Mason clutched that elephant like a lifeline, and I began to understand that Peanut represented the only consistent relationship in a young life marked by adults who appeared and disappeared without warning. "Peanut doesn't like loud noises," Mason informed me on our 3rd morning together, when I dropped a coffee mug in the kitchen, held the elephant protectively against his chest. "Mama used to make loud noises when she was sick, and it scared him." The casual way he talked about Mari's addiction broke my heart in new places every day. He had no framework for understanding that his mother's sickness was fundamentally different from a cold or flu. No way to process why Mama sometimes couldn't take care of him for weeks at a time. To him, addiction was just another unpredictable force in an already unstable world. I called in sick to Maude for the first 3 days, then requested a week of personal leave, then finally had to admit that I needed indefinite time off for a family emergency. Isabel was understanding but realistic. The fashion industry moved too quickly to hold positions for people who couldn't commit to being present. "Take care of your family," she told me during our final phone conversation. "When you're ready to come back to this world, call me. You have real potential, Lina, but potential means nothing if you can't show up consistently." Losing the internship felt like watching a carefully constructed bridge burn while I stood on the wrong side, unable to cross back to the future I'd been building. But Mason needed routines, stability, someone who could focus entirely on making his small world feel safe and predictable. We developed our own rhythm over those first weeks. Mornings meant pancakes cut into star shapes and episodes of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Afternoons were for walks to the nearby library, where Mason discovered a love of picture books about trucks and dinosaurs. And the children's librarian, Mrs. Chen, remembered his name after just 2 visits. Evenings meant easy dinners and the elaborate bedtime ritual that helped him settle into sleep in an unfamiliar place. Callie became our unexpected ally in creating stability. She worked from home some afternoons and would entertain Mason with art projects while I handled the endless phone calls required to navigate his temporary care. Conversations with Mari's caseworker, Dad's updates from Phoenix, pediatrician appointments to establish local care. "He's actually pretty amazing," Callie told me one evening, after helping Mason build an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and dining room chairs. "He's been through so much, but he's still curious about everything, still trusting." She was right. Despite everything, Mason approached the world with the kind of openness that adults spend years trying to recover. He asked endless questions about everything: why the ocean was blue, how elevators worked, where clouds came from. He collected treasures during our walks: interesting rocks, colorful leaves, bottle caps that caught the light in ways that delighted him. But there were moments when the weight of his young life showed through. Sometimes he would wake up crying for Mama in the middle of the night, confused about where he was and why she wasn't there. Sometimes he would get very still and quiet when adults talked in serious voices, his small body tensing with the learned wariness of a child who'd had to become an expert at reading dangerous moods. "Is Mama coming back?" he asked me one afternoon while we were reading stories at the library. The question came out of nowhere, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone he used for asking about lunch or playground rules. "Mama loves you very much," I said carefully, using the language his previous therapist had recommended for these conversations. "She's working with doctors to get better so she can take good care of you. While she's doing that work, you're safe with me." He nodded solemnly, then returned his attention to the book about construction vehicles, apparently satisfied with an explanation that would have frustrated any adult seeking real answers. Children, I was learning, had an incredible capacity for accepting uncertainty as long as their immediate needs for safety and love were met. 3 weeks into our arrangement, Dad called with an update that felt like both hope and heartbreak. Mari had completed detox and was enrolled in a residential treatment program. She was stable, engaged with therapy, and asking about Mason constantly. But the program was 90 days minimum, and her history of relapse meant there were no guarantees about what would happen when she completed treatment. "She wants to talk to him," Dad said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been living in hospital waiting rooms and treatment facility lobbies. "The counselors think video calls might be good for both of them, but it's your call. You know him better than anyone right now." The responsibility of making decisions about Mason's emotional well-being felt enormous and terrifying. I wasn't his parent, wasn't trained in child psychology, wasn't qualified to weigh the benefits of maintaining connection to his mother, against the potential confusion and disappointment if she relapsed again. But when I explained the situation to Mason in age-appropriate terms, that Mama was working with special doctors and wanted to see his face on the computer, his eyes lit up with the kind of joy I'd only seen when he found particularly interesting beetles during our nature walks. "Can I show her Peanut?" he asked immediately. "And my new books? And the fort Callie helped me build?" That first video call was harder than I'd expected. Mari looked fragile but alert, her face carrying the hollow-eyed intensity of early recovery. She cried when she saw Mason, and he cried too, reaching toward the computer screen like he could touch her through the pixels. "I miss you so much, baby," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom is working hard to get better so we can be together again." Mason held Peanut up to the camera and gave Mari a detailed tour of our apartment, narrating every small adventure he'd had since coming to stay with me. She listened with the desperate attention of someone trying to memorize every word, every expression, every proof that her son was thriving despite her absence. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After Mason went to bed that night, Mari called back on my phone. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried years of accumulated gratitude and guilt. "I know this isn't what you planned for your life right now. I know I haven't been reliable." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging the pattern of crisis and rescue that had defined our family dynamics for years. I wanted to be angry with her, to demand explanations for all the broken promises and midnight emergencies that had led to this moment. Instead, I found myself looking at the photo she'd sent of her and Mason from his second birthday, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, his small hand resting on her cheek with absolute trust. That version of Mari still existed somewhere, underneath the addiction, still fought to surface between relapses and treatment attempts. "Just focus on getting well," I told her. "Mason is safe. He's loved. He's learning that adults can be consistent and reliable. When you're ready to be that person for him, we'll figure out how to make that transition work." After we hung up, I sat in my darkened living room listening to Mason's steady breathing from the bedroom and wondered how long I could sustain this temporary life that was becoming increasingly permanent. My savings were dwindling, my career momentum had stalled, and my own dreams seemed to recede a little further each day into the category of luxuries I couldn't afford. But when Mason padded out of the bedroom the next morning, clutching Peanut, and asking if we could make pancakes in the shape of elephants, I realized that some responsibilities choose you rather than the other way around. Some futures arrive in forms you never expected, requiring you to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed. By the 6th week of our arrangement, I had learned to navigate Mason's world with something approaching competence. I knew that he needed exactly 8 ounces of milk in his favorite blue cup with breakfast, that he had strong opinions about which socks were too scratchy, and that he could sense adult anxiety from across a room like some kind of emotional radar system. What I hadn't learned was how to navigate the growing pressure from Dad about making our arrangement more permanent. "The treatment program wants to extend Mari's stay another month," he told me during one of our weekly check-ins. He was calling from a coffee shop near the facility in Phoenix, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice even through the phone. "She's making progress, but they think she needs more time to build stronger coping strategies. Another month." I did quick mental math. That would bring us to nearly 4 months total, well past the point where this could be considered temporary childcare. 4 months of putting my life on hold. 4 months of watching my career opportunities slip away. 4 months of becoming someone I'd never planned to be. "What does that mean for me?" I asked, watching Mason build elaborate structures with wooden blocks on our living room floor. He'd learned to play quietly during my important phone calls, sensing somehow that these conversations determined the shape of his immediate future. "It means we need to talk about more permanent arrangements," Dad said. "Mari's caseworker thinks Mason is thriving with you. His behavior reports from the daycare you found are excellent, and he talks about you constantly during their video calls." The daycare had been a necessity when my savings dipped low enough that I'd needed to find part-time work. I'd found a position at a local boutique. Not fashion editorial work, but retail that let me use my styling skills and knowledge of trends. The pay was barely enough to cover Mason's childcare and our basic expenses, but it kept us afloat while I figured out what came next. "Dad, I can't just become Mason's guardian indefinitely," I said, trying to keep my voice low enough that he wouldn't overhear. "I have my own life, my own goals. I'm 21 years old. I'm supposed to be building a career, not raising my sister's child." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Dad finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of decisions that had been made without consulting me. Lina, you're the only stable person in his life right now. Your apartment is the first place he's felt safe in months. You can't just walk away from that. Walk away. As if choosing my own future over indefinite childcare was abandonment rather than self-preservation. As if the girl who'd spent years sacrificing her own needs for family stability was being selfish for finally trying to choose herself. But looking at Mason, who had paused his block building to watch my face with the careful attention of a child, who'd learned to read adult moods for survival, I knew that Dad wasn't entirely wrong. I had become Mason's safe person, his anchor in a world that had offered him precious little stability. Walking away would be another abandonment in a young life that had already endured too many. That night, after Mason's elaborate bedtime routine, I called Mari directly for the first time since she'd entered treatment. I need to know what you're planning, I told her without preamble. Not what the counselors are telling you to say, not what you think I want to hear. What are you actually planning for Mason's future? There was a long pause before she answered, and when she did, her voice was smaller than I remembered. I want him back, she said. I want to be his mom again. For real this time. But I also know that wanting something and being capable of it are different things. Another pause. The counselors here keep asking me about my support system, about what kind of life I can realistically provide for him. And the truth is, I don't know yet. It was the most honest thing Mari had said to me in years, and it scared me more than any of her previous promises or excuses. He needs stability, I said. He needs adults who show up consistently, who keep their promises, who put his needs first, even when it's inconvenient. Can you be that person? I'm trying to learn how, she said. But Lina, I can't ask you to put your life on hold indefinitely while I figure it out. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to Mason either. He deserves better than a temporary arrangement that might fall apart. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my living room trying to imagine different futures. In one version, I found a way to pursue my career goals while providing stability for Mason. Maybe freelance writing, maybe starting my own blog, maybe building something that allowed for the flexibility that traditional fashion industry work couldn't accommodate. In another version, I made peace with the fact that my original dreams might need to evolve, that becoming Mason's guardian might open doors to different kinds of fulfillment and purpose that I hadn't previously considered. In the version that scared me most, I chose my own ambitions and watched Mason get passed between family members and temporary caretakers until he learned, like Marie had, that the adults in his life couldn't be counted on to stay. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Isabel Carrington knocked on my door just after 10 a.m., looking impeccably put together even in casual weekend clothes. I answered the door in yesterday's clothes with Mason clinging to my leg, probably looking like exactly what I was, a young woman who'd had her life reorganized by circumstances beyond her control. I hope I'm not intruding, she said, glancing down at Mason with genuine warmth. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in, see how you're doing. I invited her in, acutely aware of how different my apartment looked now. Toys scattered. Across every surface, children's books stacked on the coffee table. The general chaos that comes with reorganizing adult space around a 3-year-old's needs. Mason, who had been shy for exactly 30 seconds, immediately began showing Isabel his collection of interesting rocks, explaining the unique properties of each one with the seriousness of a museum curator. He's delightful, Isabel said, accepting a particularly shiny specimen with appropriate reverence. How are you managing everything? I gave her the honest version, the financial strain, the career uncertainty, the daily challenge of caring for a child while trying to figure out what came next. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she understood both the personal and professional dimensions of my situation. "Have you considered freelance work?" she asked eventually. "Fashion consulting, personal styling, writing pieces for online publications. The industry is changing. There are more opportunities for people who can work flexibly, build their own client base." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like a substantial contact list. "I know several stylists who built successful businesses working with private clients. And there's always demand for good fashion writing, especially from people who understand both the creative and commercial sides of the industry." It wasn't the same as the traditional editorial career I'd imagined, but it was a path that might allow me to honor both my professional ambitions and my growing commitment to Mason's well-being. After Isabel left, I spent the afternoon researching freelance opportunities while Mason napped. The possibilities were more extensive than I'd realized. Personal styling services, fashion consulting for small boutiques, writing for online platforms that were hungry for content from emerging voices. That evening, while Mason played with his blocks, I started writing the first piece I'd completed since beginning his care, an essay about navigating professional ambition while caregiving, about the ways that derailed plans sometimes led to unexpected discoveries about what mattered most. Wasn't sure where I would submit it, or whether anyone would want to publish it. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than just trying to survive the day-to-day challenges of an impossible situation. Outside, my window, San Diego's evening light painted everything golden, and I allowed myself to imagine a future where choosing Mason didn't mean abandoning myself, where love and ambition could coexist in forms I was still learning to recognize. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, jarring me awake with the specific terror that only middle-of-the-night phone calls can produce. Mason stirred next to me in the bed we'd learned to share, muttering something in his sleep about dinosaurs and trucks. It was Dad, calling from Phoenix General Hospital. "Mari's back in emergency," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the exhausted resignation of someone who'd walked this path too many times before. "Overdose. They found her in the parking lot of the treatment facility." The parking lot. After 3 months of residential treatment, of therapy sessions and group meetings and video calls where she'd seemed stronger, more present, more like the sister I remembered from before addiction rewrote her story. After all those conversations about building coping strategies and developing support systems and creating a stable life for Mason. Is she? I couldn't finish the question. She's alive. Stable. But Lina, there's something else. Dad's voice dropped to the tone he used for delivering news that would change everything. They found a hospital bracelet in her pocket. Not from this admission, from 3 weeks ago. She's been leaving the facility at night, using again, and coming back. Before anyone noticed, 3 weeks, which meant that every video call with Mason, every conversation about her progress, every moment when I'd allowed myself to hope that this time might be different, had been built on lies. She'd been looking into the camera and telling her son that Mama was getting better while actively sabotaging her own recovery. I sat up in bed, careful not to wake Mason, and tried to process what this meant for all of us. The treatment program would discharge her. They had zero-tolerance policies for active use. Dad couldn't stay in Phoenix indefinitely, managing crisis after crisis while his own life fell apart. And Mason would continue to need someone who showed up consistently, who kept promises, who created the kind of stability that let a 3-year-old feel safe enough to sleep through the night. What happens now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The caseworker wants to discuss long-term placement options, Dad said. Foster care or... He trailed off, unable to say the words that would make my temporary guardianship permanent. After we hung up, I lay in the darkness listening to Mason's steady breathing and feeling the weight of a decision that wasn't really a choice. I could continue putting my life on hold indefinitely, hoping that Mari would eventually become the parent Mason deserved. Or I could accept that loving someone with addiction meant accepting that recovery wasn't a straight line, that relapse was always possible, and that the child in my bed needed security that didn't depend on his mother's sobriety. The next morning, Mason woke up with the same routine that had become our shared ritual, climbing onto my pillow, announcing his hunger level, asking if we could have pancakes shaped like his current favorite animal. Today, it was elephants, in honor of Peanut, who had taken up permanent residence on Mason's side of the bed. I made elephant pancakes while he told me an elaborate story about a dream where he and Peanut had flown to space in a rocket ship made of blocks. His imagination had flourished during our months together, probably because he finally had a stable audience for his stories. Someone who listened with full attention and asked follow-up questions about the logistics of elephant space travel. "Tia Lina," he said, carefully cutting his pancake elephant into bite-sized pieces. "Are you going to be my mama now?" The question hit me like cold water. I'd been so focused on the practical arrangements, the legal implications, the way this decision would reshape my future, that I hadn't fully considered how it looked from his perspective. "What makes you ask that, baby?" I said, buying time while I figured out how to navigate this conversation honestly. "Because Mama is sick for a really long time, and you take care of me like mamas do," he said with the matter-of-fact logic that children apply to complex situations. "And I like living with you. You don't get angry at the loud noises, and you remember which stories I like best." The casual way he referenced Marie's angry outbursts broke my heart in a new place. This little boy had learned to measure love by the absence of volatility, to find security in predictable routines and gentle voices. He deserved so much more than survival. He deserved to thrive. "I love taking care of you," I told him honestly. "And no matter what happens, you'll always be safe and loved." That afternoon, while Mason napped, I called the family court office to begin researching the process for seeking legal guardianship. The social worker who answered my questions was kind but realistic about the timeline and requirements involved. Given the mother's history and current situation, temporary guardianship could potentially become permanent, she explained. But it's a significant legal and emotional commitment. Have you discussed this decision with family members? Do you have support systems in place? Support systems. I thought about Callie, who had become Mason's unofficial aunt, who helped with childcare when I needed to work, and who had started keeping mac and cheese and juice boxes stocked in our apartment. I thought about Mrs. Chen at the library, who saved new picture books for Mason and who had connected me with a parenting support group for young guardians. I thought about Isabel, who had become an unexpected mentor, helping me build freelance clients while accommodating the schedule flexibility that caring for Mason required. Maybe I didn't have the traditional support system of married parents with extended family nearby, but I had built something that worked. A network of people who understood that families came in all configurations, that love and commitment mattered more than biology or conventional timelines. That evening, I video called Dad to discuss the guardianship process. He was sitting in a different coffee shop, looking older than his 54 years, wearing the expression of a man who'd run out of solutions. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. It's not temporary anymore, Lina. This would be your life, probably until he's 18. That's 15 years of putting his needs first, of making decisions based on what's best for him instead of what you want for yourself. 15 years. It sounded like forever and no time at all, depending on how I looked at it. 15 years of bedtime stories and school events and teaching him to drive and helping him navigate heartbreak and college applications. 15 years of being someone's safe person, their home base, their proof that adults could be trusted to stay. Dad, I've been putting other people's needs first my whole life, I said. First it was making sure I didn't add to your stress after Mom died. Then it was managing around Mari's addiction, being the stable daughter who didn't cause problems. Maybe it's time I chose which sacrifices I want to make. This is different, he insisted. This is choosing to become a parent at 21. This is giving up the future you plan to build someone else's life. He wasn't wrong. But he also wasn't seeing the whole picture. The way caring for Mason had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. The way my freelance work was developing into something that might be more fulfilling than the traditional career path I'd originally imagined. The way love had expanded my definition of what constituted a meaningful life. Maybe the future I planned wasn't the only one worth building, I said. Maybe there are kinds of success that don't look like what I expected at 18. After we hung up, I sat on my living room floor, surrounded by the evidence of the life Mason and I had built together. His art projects taped to the refrigerator, his collection of library books stacked on the coffee table, the elaborate blanket, fort that had become a permanent fixture in our living room. This wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself at 21, but it was a life filled with purpose and connection, and the kind of daily meaning that came from being essential to someone else's well-being. It was a life that had taught me that ambition and love weren't opposites. They were different ways of building something that mattered. When Mason woke up from his nap and found me still sitting on the floor, he climbed into my lap with Peanut and asked if we could read the story about the elephant who learned to fly. Again? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. We'd read that story at least 50 times in the past month. Again, he confirmed, settling against my chest with the complete trust of a child who knew that this adult would keep reading the same story as many times as he needed to hear it. As I opened to the first page, I realized that some stories were worth repeating, that some futures were worth choosing, even when they looked nothing like what you'd originally planned. And some kinds of love required you to become bigger than the person you thought you were, to discover that your dreams could evolve without disappearing entirely. The legal guardianship paperwork sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I could bring myself to fill it out. Official forms with words like permanent placement and parental rights that would transform our temporary arrangement into something irreversible. Callie found me staring at the documents on Thursday evening while Mason built elaborate towers with his blocks, occasionally narrating the architectural decisions to Peanut, who served as both audience and construction supervisor. "You don't have to decide today," she said, settling down next to me at the table. "You don't have to decide this week." "But I do," I said. "Mari's being discharged from the hospital tomorrow. The treatment facility won't take her back after this relapse. Dad can't stay in Phoenix indefinitely managing her crises. The case worker needs an answer about Mason's long-term placement." I'd been carrying these facts around for days, turning them over like stones in my pocket, trying to find an angle that didn't require me to choose between my original dreams and this unexpected responsibility that had become the center of my world. "What do you want to do?" Callie asked. "Not what you think you should do, not what would make everyone else happy. What do you actually want?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question since Mason arrived. Everyone else, Dad, Mari, The caseworker, even well-meaning friends, had focused on what made sense, what was practical, what served Mason's best interests. No one had asked what I wanted my life to look like. "I want to keep him," I said, the words coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. "I want to be his person, the one he can count on no matter what. I want to watch him grow up and learn, to read and discover what he's passionate about. I want to be there for his first day of school and his high school graduation and all the ordinary Tuesday afternoons in between." Saying it out loud made it real in a way that all my internal wrestling hadn't accomplished. This wasn't just about obligation or family duty. This was about love, about choosing to build a life around someone whose happiness had become inseparable from my own. "I also want to keep writing," I continued. "I want to build something professional, that feels meaningful, that uses the skills I've developed. I want to prove that you can be a good parent and still have ambitions that belong entirely to you." Callie nodded, like this made perfect sense, like wanting multiple things at once wasn't a contradiction that needed to be resolved. "So let's figure out how to make that work," she said. "Let's build the kind of life that includes both." That weekend, I reached out to Isabel about the possibility of expanding my freelance work. We met at a coffee shop in Hillcrest while Mason played at the nearby park with a babysitter I'd hired, my first time paying for childcare for my own social plans rather than work necessity. "I've been thinking about your situation," Isabel said, settling into her chair with the confident posture of someone who'd learned to navigate complex professional challenges. "There's definitely demand for the kind of writing you do, fashion analysis that connects trends to broader cultural moments. And your perspective as a young guardian brings something unique to discussions about work-life balance." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like a substantial list of contacts. "I know editors at 3 online publications who are looking for contributors. The pay isn't huge per piece, but it's consistent work that you can do on your own schedule. And there's potential for growth if you can establish yourself as someone who delivers quality content reliably." Quality content reliably. It sounded like a foundation I could build on. A way to pursue professional growth while maintaining the schedule flexibility that caring for Mason required. "There's also the styling work," she continued. "I have clients who need someone for personal shopping, closet organization, styling for special events. It's not editorial fashion, but it's creative work that pays well and lets you set your own hours." By the time we finished our conversation, I had contact information for 5 potential clients and a clear sense of how I might build a sustainable career that accommodated the realities of single parenthood. That evening, while Mason played with his bath toys and told Peanut elaborate stories about underwater adventures, I called Dad to tell him about my decision. "I'm going to file for guardianship," I said without preamble. "I'm going to become Mason's legal guardian and build a life that works for both of us." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if he was relieved or disappointed, or some combination of both. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "This changes everything, Lina. There's no going back once you sign those papers." "I'm sure," I said, watching Mason carefully arrange his toy boats in what he'd announced was a very important parking lot for water cars. "I'm not doing this because it's expected, or because I don't have other options. I'm doing this because I want to be his parent, because we're good together, because I can imagine a future that includes both of us thriving." Dad's sigh carried years of accumulated worry and relief. "He's lucky to have you," he said. "You've become the kind of person your mother would be proud of." It was the first time he'd mentioned Mom in the context of my current situation, and the comparison hit me with unexpected force. I'd been so focused on how this decision would change my future that I hadn't considered how it connected me to her legacy, the way she'd chosen love and commitment even when it required sacrificing other possibilities. After Mason's bedtime routine, that night I sat at my kitchen table and finally filled out the guardianship paperwork. Each signature felt like a small ceremony, a formal acknowledgement of the commitment I'd already been living for months. When I reached the section asking for my relationship to the child, I paused. The legal options were limited: aunt, family, friend, other relative. None of them captured what I'd actually become to Mason, the way we'd chosen each other across the space of an impossible situation. I checked aunt because it was accurate, but I knew that the real relationship we'd built couldn't be contained in legal categories. I was his tia Lina, the person who knew that he needed exactly 3 bedtime stories and preferred his sandwiches cut into triangles and believed that Peanut had serious opinions about bath temperature. As I sealed the envelope containing our future, I realized that some of the most important decisions we make happen gradually, in the accumulation of daily choices to show up and stay present and choose love, even when it's inconvenient. The paperwork was just the official acknowledgement of a commitment that had been growing for months, one elephant-shaped pancake and bedtime story at a time. Outside my window, San Diego's evening lights twinkled like promises I was finally ready to keep. Not the ones I'd made to my 18-year-old self about the kind of life I thought I wanted, but new promises about the kind of person I was becoming, the kind of home I was building, the kind of love that could expand to include dreams I'd never known I was capable of having. The next morning, Mason woke up with his usual routine of climbing onto my pillow and announcing his breakfast preferences. Today, he wanted pancakes shaped like rockets because he dreamed about flying to visit Mama in a spaceship made of clouds. "Tia Lina," he said, watching me mix batter in our small kitchen. "Are we going to live together for a really long time?" "Yes, baby," I said, flipping his first rocket pancake with the precision I'd developed over months of practice. "We're going to live together for a really long time." He nodded with satisfaction, then returned his attention to explaining to Peanut why rockets needed to be perfectly round to fly properly. The conversation was conducted with the seriousness of someone who'd learned that the adults in his life kept their promises, that home was a place where you could count on pancakes and stories, and someone who listened to your ideas about space travel. I watched him eat his rocket pancakes while planning his day. Library time to return yesterday's books and select new ones. Playground time if the weather held. Maybe a walk to the beach to add to his collection of interesting rocks. Ordinary moments that had become extraordinary because they were ours, because we'd built them together, because they represented the future we'd chosen, rather than the one that had been chosen for us. The family court hearing was scheduled for a gray Tuesday morning in December, exactly 4 months after Dad had first knocked on my door with Mason and a suitcase. I'd imagined this day would feel more ceremonial, more like the dramatic courtroom scenes from movies where families are transformed by judicial decisions and official pronouncements. Instead, it felt like paperwork. Necessary, important paperwork that would formalize what had already become reality through months of daily choices to show up for each other. Mason stayed with Callie during the hearing. I'd considered bringing him, wanting him to be part of the moment that would make our family official, but the social worker had advised against it. "Court can be unpredictable," she'd explained. "Better to have this conversation between adults, and then celebrate with him later." Dad flew in from Phoenix the night before, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. Mari was living in a transitional housing program now, working part-time at a coffee shop and attending outpatient therapy. She was clean again, but everyone involved, Mari included, understood that her recovery remained fragile, that being Mason's primary caretaker wasn't realistic in the near future. She wants what's best for him, Dad told me over dinner the night before the hearing. She knows you've become his person, that you've given him the kind of stability she can't provide right now. Mari had written a letter to the court supporting my guardianship petition, acknowledging that Mason was thriving in my care and that she wasn't prepared to resume full-time parenting responsibilities. Reading it the night before the hearing, I'd cried for the sister who'd found the courage to choose Mason's well-being over her own desire to reclaim the role she'd lost to addiction. The hearing itself lasted less than an hour. The judge, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the case file while asking straightforward questions about my ability to provide for Mason's physical, emotional, and educational needs. "Miss Rivera, you're 21 years old," she said, looking at me over her reading glasses. "This is a significant responsibility for someone your age. Have you fully considered the long-term implications of this commitment?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "I've been Mason's primary caretaker for 4 months. I have stable housing, growing income from freelance work, and a support system that helps me provide consistent care. Most importantly, Mason and I have built a relationship based on trust and security. He's thriving, and I'm committed to continuing to put his needs first." The social worker testified about Mason's progress in my care. His improved sleep patterns, his engagement at daycare, his obvious attachment to me as his primary caregiver. Dad testified about the family history, about Mari's struggles with addiction, about his confidence in my ability to provide the stability Mason needed. When the judge asked if I understood that guardianship would give me full legal authority to make decisions about Mason's medical care, education, and general welfare, I said yes, though the weight of that responsibility still felt overwhelming. "And you understand that this arrangement continues until he reaches majority, unless circumstances change significantly enough to warrant review?" 17 years. The number hung in the air between us like a bridge I was choosing to cross. 17. Years of soccer games and parent-teacher conferences and helping with homework and teaching him to drive and watching him become whoever he was meant to be. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I understand." The judge made some notes in the file, consulted with the court clerk, then looked back at me with what might have been approval. "Miss Rivera, the court finds that you have demonstrated the ability to provide appropriate care for the minor child, that guardianship is in his best interests, and that you understand the responsibilities you're undertaking. I'm granting your petition for legal guardianship." Just like that, Mason became my son in all the ways that mattered legally. No dramatic music, no ceremonial speeches, just the quiet acknowledgement that love and commitment could create families in forms that didn't fit traditional categories. After the hearing, Dad and I went to lunch at a small cafe near the courthouse. We ordered sandwiches we barely ate while processing what had just happened. "Your mother would be so proud," he said, echoing his words from our phone conversation weeks earlier. "She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met. She would have loved seeing you become Mason's parent." I'd been thinking about Mom a lot lately, wondering what she would have advised about this decision. She died when I was too young to have real conversations about love and sacrifice and the way families could be broken and rebuilt in new configurations. But I hoped she would have understood that choosing Mason wasn't abandoning my dreams. It was expanding them to include possibilities I'd never known existed. When I got home, Mason launched himself at me with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about his morning with Callie and the elaborate Lego city they'd built while I was gone. He didn't know that anything official had changed about our relationship, but I could see in his relaxed posture and easy smile that he'd sensed the adult anxiety lifting, that he understood on some level that the question marks hanging over our future had been resolved. "Tia Lina," he said, settling into my lap with Peanut for our afternoon story time. "Can we read the elephant book? The one where the mama elephant takes care of the baby elephant who isn't hers?" I'd never noticed that plot detail before, but hearing Mason describe it that way made me realize he'd been processing our situation through the stories we read together, finding frameworks for understanding how families could form through choice, rather than just biology. "Of course, baby," I said, reaching for the familiar book. That's one of my favorites, too. As I read about the mama elephant who adopted the baby elephant who needed a home, I realized that Mason had been teaching me as much as I'd been teaching him about what it meant to choose each other, to build security through daily acts of care and consistency. That evening, after Mason's bedtime routine, I called Isabel to share the news about the guardianship being finalized. "Congratulations," she said, and I could hear genuine warmth in her voice. "How does it feel to be officially a parent?" "Terrifying and perfect," I said honestly. "Like I've just signed up for the most important job I'll ever have." "You have," she said. "And from what I've seen, you're going to be amazing at it. The fashion industry will still be here when you're ready to engage with it more fully." "Good. Talent doesn't disappear just because life takes unexpected turns." After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of the life Mason and I had built. His artwork on the refrigerator, his library books stacked on the coffee table, the elaborate blanket fort that had become a permanent feature of our space. This wasn't the life I'd planned for myself at 21, but it was a life filled with purpose and love and the daily satisfaction of being essential to someone else's happiness and security. It was a life that had taught me that dreams could evolve without disappearing, that ambition and devotion weren't opposites, but different ways of building something meaningful. Outside my window, San Diego's evening lights sparkled like promises I was finally ready to keep. Promises about showing up consistently, about choosing love even when it required sacrifice, about building a future that honored both my own growth and Mason's need for stability. In his bedroom, Mason slept peacefully with Peanut tucked against his chest, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring elephant pancakes and story time and all the ordinary magic of a life shared with someone who chose to stay. 2 years later, I stood in the bathroom of our new apartment, still small, but with a separate bedroom for Mason and windows that caught the morning light just right, getting ready for what felt like the most important interview of my life. Mason, now 5 and starting kindergarten in the fall, sat on my bed sorting through my jewelry box with the focused attention he'd once reserved for his button collection. He'd grown tall and confident, his vocabulary expanding daily with new questions about everything from why clouds moved to how elevators worked. "Tia Lina, can I wear this one?" he asked, holding up a silver bracelet Callie had given me for my birthday. "It's very sparkly." "That's for grown-ups, baby," I said, applying mascara with the careful precision I'd learned from years of studying fashion magazines. "But you can wear your dinosaur watch." The interview was with a local lifestyle magazine that wanted to hire a full-time fashion and culture writer. It would be my first traditional employment since mode, my chance to return to the kind of work I'd originally envisioned for myself, while maintaining the flexibility that single parenthood required. Over the past 2 years, my freelance career had grown beyond what I'd initially imagined possible. I wrote regularly for 3 online publications, had built a steady clientele for personal styling services, and had even started a blog about navigating career ambitions as a young single parent that had gained a surprising following. But this job felt different, more stable, more connected to the fashion industry community I'd originally wanted to join, more like the bridge between the life I'd planned and the one I'd actually built. "Are you nervous?" Mason asked, settling next to me while I finished getting ready. At 5, he'd become remarkably perceptive about adult emotions, probably a skill developed during his early years of needing to read the moods of unreliable adults. "A little bit," I admitted. "But nervous in a good way, like when you're excited about something new, but also want to make sure you do your best." He nodded solemnly, then brightened with the sudden inspiration that marked most of his ideas. "You should bring Peanut for good luck." Peanut still went everywhere with Mason, though the elephant showed even more wear now after 2 years of constant companionship. One ear had been repaired twice, and the gray fabric was soft enough that Mason could twist it between his fingers when he needed comfort. "I think Peanut should stay here and help you and Callie build something amazing while I'm gone," I said. "But thank you for the suggestion." Callie had volunteered to watch Mason during the interview, taking a half day from her own job at a marketing firm where she'd been promoted twice in the past 2 years. She'd become his unofficial aunt, the person who understood his elaborate bedtime requirements and knew exactly how to cut his sandwiches to avoid meltdowns. "You've got this," she told me as I gathered my portfolio and prepared to leave. "You're not the same person who walked into Mode 3 years ago. You're someone who's proven she can handle anything, who has real experience balancing creativity and responsibility." The magazine's offices were in a converted warehouse in downtown San Diego, the kind of space that managed to be both industrial and welcoming. The editor who interviewed me, a woman named Sarah Chen, was about my age, but with the polished confidence of someone who'd never had to rebuild her career around unexpected responsibilities. "Your portfolio is impressive," she said, reviewing samples of my writing and styling work. "But I have to ask, you're a single parent to a 5-year-old. This position requires some evening events, occasional travel for Fashion Week coverage. How would you manage those responsibilities?" It was the question I'd been preparing for, the challenge that had shaped every professional decision I'd made since becoming Mason's guardian. "I have excellent childcare support," I said. "But more importantly, I've learned to be incredibly efficient with my time, to prioritize effectively, and to produce quality work under pressure. Single parenthood has actually made me a better professional, more focused, more organized, more committed to delivering results." I pulled out my phone and showed her examples of my recent work. A trend analysis piece I'd written during Mason's nap times. Photos from a styling session I'd completed while he played quietly in the client's boutique. Social media content I'd created that connected fashion trends to broader cultural moments about family and identity. "This is the perspective I bring to fashion writing," I continued. "I understand how style intersects with real life, how people use clothing to navigate complex identities and responsibilities. My experience as a young parent gives me insight into audiences that fashion media often overlooks." Sarah nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Tell me about your long-term goals. Where do you see yourself professionally in 5 years?" 5 years. Mason would be 10, probably tall enough to reach the kitchen counter and confident enough to have opinions about his own style choices. I would be 28, with years of experience balancing parenthood and professional growth. "I want to establish myself as a writer who brings depth and authenticity to fashion journalism," I said. "Someone who can cover industry trends while also exploring how style connects to identity, culture, and social change. I'd love to eventually write a book about fashion and family, about how we use clothing to express different aspects of ourselves as we navigate different roles. After the interview, I picked up Mason from Callie's office, where he'd spent the afternoon helping her organize promotional materials and charming her co-workers with his extensive knowledge of dinosaur facts. "How did it go?" Callie asked, while Mason showed me a drawing he'd made of what he imagined my new office would look like, complete with a desk big enough for fashion magazines and a special chair for visitors like him. "Good, I think," I said. Different than I expected. More like a conversation between equals than a job interview. The call came 3 days later while Mason and I were at the beach, adding to his collection of interesting shells and watching surfers navigate the afternoon waves. "Lina, this is Sarah Chen," the voice said through my phone. "We'd like to offer you the position." I'd imagined this moment for years, getting the call that would validate my professional ambitions, that would prove that all the sacrifice and hard work had led somewhere meaningful. But standing on the beach with Mason building elaborate sandcastles nearby, I realized that validation had been happening all along, in smaller moments and daily choices that had nothing to do with external recognition. "I'm thrilled," I told Sarah. "When would you like me to start?" "Next month," she said. "We're planning a feature series about style and identity, and your perspective would be perfect for leading that coverage." After we hung up, I sat on the beach watching Mason explain to a small crab why it shouldn't be afraid of his sand construction equipment, and I felt something that might have been completion, not because I'd achieved everything I'd originally wanted, but because I'd built something better and more authentic than what I'd originally imagined. That evening, while Mason played with his bath toys and told Peanut about the day's adventures, I called Dad to share the news. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he said, and I could hear the emotion in his voice. "You've built something beautiful, not just the career but the life. The way you've raised Mason, the person you've become, it's exactly what your mother hoped for you." After Mason's bedtime routine, I sat in our living room writing in the journal I'd started keeping during our first weeks together. Tonight's entry was about new beginnings, about the way some dreams needed to be broken down and rebuilt to accommodate the fullness of an actual life. I wrote about Mason's excitement when I'd told him about the new job, how he'd immediately wanted to know if my office would have a special place for his drawings. I wrote about the way our family had been formed through choice rather than biology, through daily commitments to show up for each other even when it was inconvenient. I wrote about Mari, who was 18 months clean now, and building a relationship with Mason through careful, supervised visits that honored both her love for him and the reality that I was his primary parent. I wrote about Dad, who had learned to see strength in the choices that didn't look like traditional sacrifice. Outside my window, San Diego's evening lights twinkled like promises that had been kept through small acts of daily faith. In his bedroom, Mason slept peacefully with Peanut, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new adventures and that Tia Lina would be there to share them. I closed my journal and looked around our apartment. At Mason's artwork covering the refrigerator, at the professional portfolio stacked next to his library books, at the evidence of a life that had been built through choosing love and ambition as partners rather than competitors. This wasn't the future I'd planned for myself at 18, but it was a future I'd chosen repeatedly, one day at a time, one elephant pancake and bedtime story and career opportunity at a time. It was a life that had taught me that dreams could evolve without disappearing, that family could be created through commitment rather than just blood, and that some of the most important work we do happens in the spaces between our official accomplishments. In the morning, Mason would wake up with his usual routine of climbing onto my pillow and announcing his breakfast preferences. I would make whatever shape pancakes he requested, and we would plan our day together. Library time and playground time and all the ordinary moments that had become extraordinary because they were ours. And in a few weeks, I would start a new job that honored both the professional skills I developed and the perspective I'd gained from choosing to build my life around love, rather than just ambition. I would write about fashion and culture from the viewpoint of someone who understood that style was just one way people expressed their complex identities, their multiple roles, their commitment to showing up authentically in whatever life they'd chosen to create. It was a good life, not perfect, not what I'd originally planned, but good in ways that couldn't be measured by traditional markers of success. It was a life built on the foundation of daily choices to choose each other, to keep promises, to find meaning in the spaces between dreams and reality where actual living happens. The morning of Mason's 10th birthday started the way most of our mornings did, with pancakes in impossible shapes and questions I couldn't answer but always tried to. Today's theme was the solar system, a request he'd made the night before while brushing his teeth with the same intensity he applied to all things space-related. "I want Saturn," he'd said, foam still dotting his chin. "With the rings. Realistic ones. And maybe Jupiter too if you think the pan is big enough." I'd laughed, watching him in the bathroom mirror as he considered the logistics of planetary pancakes with the seriousness of a NASA engineer. "We'll see what we can do, astronaut." Now, at our kitchen table, he sat barefoot and focused, carefully, orbiting blueberry moons around the pancake Saturn I'd crafted with a steady hand and a creative interpretation of whipped cream. The rings weren't perfect, more like lopsided halos than the elegant bands we'd studied in his astronomy books, but Mason's eyes held the kind of wonder that transformed kitchen table breakfast into intergalactic exploration. "You think people live on this one?" he asked, pointing his fork at the pancake planet like a scientist about to publish his first theory. "Like, what if they're having breakfast right now too, but their pancakes are made of space dust?" I smiled, flipping the next one onto his plate, this time attempting Jupiter's swirling storms with a careful drizzle of maple syrup. "If they do, I bet they've got great views. Imagine looking up and seeing those ring formations every morning, instead of our palm trees." Mason's laugh still made my chest ache in the best way. This rising sound that echoed around the kitchen, bouncing off the mismatched coffee mugs and the drawings he'd taped to the refrigerator, grounding the space with joy. At 10, he had his father's eyebrows, thick and expressive, my sister's stubborn chin that jutted forward when he was thinking hard, and the kind of wide-eyed wonder that no trauma had managed to dim. His hair stuck up in 3 different directions this morning, and there was already syrup on his pajama shirt. But somehow, through all the chaos and heartbreak and uncertainty of the past 7 years, he'd become this, a boy who asked big questions and still expected the world to answer with kindness. Our apartment looked different now. Bigger, brighter, filled with the accumulated life of 2 people who'd learned to make space for each other. After years of careful saving, freelance writing late into the night while Mason slept, and a few lucky breaks that felt like small miracles, I'd managed to upgrade us to a 2-bedroom in the same San Diego neighborhood. It wasn't fancy. The carpet was still the same beige that had witnessed 1,000 other families, and the kitchen faucet had a tendency to drip. But it was ours. My room was still small and functional, furnished with the same desk where I'd written my first published essay and the bed that had weathered both sleepless nights and peaceful Sunday mornings. But Mason had a space of his own now, a room with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling arranged in actual constellations he'd researched himself, bookshelves filled with dog-eared graphic novels and science books with titles like the hidden reality of black holes, and what if Mars had oceans. And a corner dedicated to Peanut, who, after all these years, was still his most loyal companion. Peanut had weathered more adventures than most adults. 2 moves, 3 birthday parties, a brief hospitalization due to a jelly stain emergency that Mason still referenced as the Great Grape Incident, and most recently, a mission to Mars conducted entirely from our living room couch with cardboard control panels and sound effects Mason provided himself. The stuffed dog was held together now by a patchwork of stitches, fabric glue, and love, one ear slightly more faded than the other, a small tear in his side that we'd repaired with a star-shaped patch that Mason insisted made him more aerodynamic for space travel. I'd offered to buy a replacement once, during a particularly rough patch when Peanut's stuffing had started to migrate. Mason had looked at me like I'd suggested giving up a kidney. "Some things can't be replaced, Tia," he'd said solemnly, clutching Peanut closer. "He knows all my secrets. A new dog wouldn't understand about the time I was scared of the dark, or how I like my sandwiches cut into triangles, or why I always check under the bed even though I know there's nothing there." He was right, of course. Some bonds transcend logic. At precisely 7:45 a.m., Callie walked in like a sitcom entrance, holding a box of star-shaped donuts from the bakery 3 blocks over and balancing a birthday card between her teeth. Her hair was still damp from her morning run, and she wore the kind of effortless smile that had become as familiar to me as my own reflection. "Double carbs for double digits," she said, grinning around the envelope as Mason barreled into her arms with the force of a small hurricane. "And these aren't just any donuts. They're galaxy donuts. See the glaze? It's supposed to look like the Milky Way."
Callie had never been just a roommate. Not really. The apartment listing that brought us together 7 years ago had been practical necessity, but what grew from it was family in the truest sense of the word. An aunt, a co-parent in every way, but legally, a constant presence through sleep regressions, stomach bugs, science fair meltdowns, and the 1,000 small crises that make up raising a child. She still worked in marketing, now at a company that actually valued work-life balance, and didn't expect their employees to sacrifice their souls for brand awareness. Her office was filled with Mason's drawings, elaborate space battles and detailed diagrams of imaginary planets, and a mug that read, "World's Best Backup Parent," a Mother's Day gift from Mason that she'd accepted with tears in her eyes. "You're getting taller," she told him, holding him at arm's length with exaggerated inspection. "Pretty soon you'll be taller than me, and then who's going to reach the high shelves?" "I'll still make you pancakes," Mason promised solemnly. "Even when I'm grown up and have my own space station." "Space station?" I raised an eyebrow, flipping the last Jupiter onto his plate. "Well, yeah. I mean, someone has to figure out how to make good pancakes in zero gravity. It's probably a serious scientific problem that needs solving." After breakfast, I dropped him off at school, where cupcakes decorated with edible glitter and a classroom scavenger hunt awaited. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had created a space-themed treasure hunt that would take the kids around the school grounds, complete with clues written in alien language that was really just backwards English. I stayed just long enough to see his face light up when she announced it was his birthday to the class, still young enough to feel proud of the attention, still innocent enough not to hide that pride behind the cool indifference that would probably arrive in a year or two. "See you at 3, Space Cadet," I called as he disappeared into the classroom, already deep in conversation with his best friend Alex about whether aliens would prefer chocolate or vanilla cupcakes. Later, alone in the apartment, I stood at the sink and let the silence settle around me like a comfortable blanket. I didn't get many moments like this. Just me, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft traffic sounds drifting through the open windows, the distant sound of someone's music playing 3 apartments over. I looked out the kitchen window and saw the familiar rhythm of our neighborhood. A woman jogging with a stroller, checking her fitness tracker with the determination of someone training for something important. A teenager unlocking their bike with practiced efficiency, backpack already slung over one shoulder. Someone in a bright yellow vest delivering groceries to the elderly man who lived in the blue house and always waved when we walked by. It struck me in a quiet, gentle way. How much life we'd managed to build in the in-between spaces, in the moments that weren't marked by milestones or achievements, but by the simple act of showing up for each other, day after day. I thought about the old life sometimes, the one I thought I was building before Mason arrived, like a beautiful disruption to everything I thought I wanted. A life filled with deadlines that felt urgent, runway shows that glittered with possibility, and polished portfolio pieces that spoke in the language of ambition I'd learned to speak fluently. A life I once believed I needed to feel successful, to feel like I mattered in a world that measured worth in bylines and brand recognition. But this life, our life, had given me something deeper, something that couldn't be quantified in publications or professional accolades. It had taught me to hold space for 2 truths at once: that I still loved fashion and storytelling with the same passion that had driven me through college and those early career years, and that the way I expressed those loves had changed, evolved, into something more intentional, more connected to the life I was actually living, rather than the life I thought I was supposed to want. My freelance career had grown steadily, like a plant that had found the right balance of sunlight and water. After years of late-night writing sessions conducted in the blue glow of my laptop screen, while Mason narrated elaborate scenes from his toy battles in the next room, and morning coffee-fueled edits squeezed in between packing lunches and finding matching socks, I had built a portfolio I was genuinely proud of. My essays now appeared regularly in Mode, exploring the intersection of fashion and identity, sustainability and style, the ways clothing could tell stories about who we were and who we wanted to become. I was also a contributing editor at a smaller online fashion publication that focused specifically on cultural intersections and underrepresented voices in style, pieces that dug deeper than trend reports, that asked questions about access and representation, and the responsibility of an industry built on aspiration. I hadn't returned to the rigid 9-to-5 structure of traditional publishing, with its endless meetings and office politics and the peculiar exhaustion that came from spending 8 hours a day in fluorescent lighting. I didn't want to. What I'd built allowed me to attend Mason's school performances without requesting time off, to show up at PTA meetings where I actually had opinions about fundraising strategies and playground equipment, to take spontaneous beach trips when he needed to talk to the ocean about whatever 10-year-old crisis was weighing on his mind. Ambition didn't disappear when your life changed shape. It evolved, found new channels, learned to flow around the obstacles and opportunities that mattered more than the straight line you'd once thought success required. Mari had been clean for over 3 years now. The woman who walked back into our lives bore little resemblance to the sister I'd lost to addiction years ago. But she carried familiar echoes. The way she laughed with her whole body, the stubborn set of her shoulders when she'd made up her mind about something, the gentle way she spoke to Mason that suggested depths of love that had survived even the worst of times. She was working at a nonprofit that helped women in recovery re-enter the workforce, using her own experience to guide others through the practical challenges of rebuilding a life from scratch. Her relationship with Mason was carefully and intentionally rebuilt over time. Supervised visits at first, awkward conversations in coffee shops where they drew pictures and shared cookies, then longer weekends filled with trips to the zoo and science museums. always on the foundation of honesty about what had happened and what was happening now. She knew I was his parent, had been from the moment she'd made the impossible choice to let me take him when she couldn't care for him herself. And Mason understood, with the clarity that children often possess about complex emotional truths, that love didn't have to fit neatly into titles or timeframes, that some mothers were born into the role, and some were made by circumstances and choice, and the thousand small acts of care that add up to a life. That night, we celebrated with a small party in our backyard, under the string lights Callie and I had hung last summer and never taken down because they made even ordinary Tuesday evenings feel festive. Just family. Callie, Mari, Dad, who'd driven down from Los Angeles with a car full of presents and stories from his latest photography project, and a few friends from school whose parents had become part of our extended chosen family over years, of playdates and shared carpool duties. Mason wore a paper crown that he'd decorated himself with planets and rocket ships, and gave a speech thanking each person individually for their contributions to his space education and general well-being. When he got to me, he paused, considering his words with the seriousness he brought to all important communications. "And to Tia Lina," he said, holding up a star-shaped donut like a microphone, "for making the best Saturn pancakes and the best life. For reading me space books even when you're tired, and for always believing that I can grow up to be an astronaut, even though you're probably a little scared about me going that far away. I'm glad you're my mom." I didn't cry in front of everyone. I saved the tears for later, when we were doing dishes, and he was humming to himself while wiping plates with the kind of focus that nearly made me laugh, his arms still sticky with frosting, and his paper crown slightly askew. In that moment, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a life well lived, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing you've built something good, something that will last. Later, as he curled into bed with Peanut tucked securely under one arm and his new telescope positioned carefully on his nightstand, where he could reach it easily for any middle-of-the-night star emergencies, he looked at me with that same open-eyed certainty he'd carried since he was 3 years old, and the world still made perfect sense. We're gonna be okay forever, right? I tucked the blanket under his chin, smoothed down his still rebellious hair, and felt the weight of the promise I was making. Forever and ever. And we were. Not perfect, never polished, but okay in all the ways that mattered most. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.